Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session on sharp power. Today, we are very lucky to have Julia Bader, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. Before joining the university in July 2012, she worked as a research fellow at the German Development Institute in Bonn. She holds an MA in Politics and Management from Constance University and a PhD in Political Science from Heidelberg University. Julia's research focuses on China's foreign relations, regime transition and autocratic stability, international relations and foreign policy, development assistance, and human rights. She is the author of the monograph, China's Foreign Relations and the Survival of Autocracies, which has been published with Routledge. Her work has appeared in academic journals such as International Studies Quarterly, European Journal of Political Research, Journal of Peace Research, Foreign Policy Analysis, Democratization, International Studies Review, Contemporary Politics, and in several collective book projects. Her research on the Chinese Communist Party's international department has been featured in The Economist and in South China Morning Post. She has been interviewed for the VPRO's Tegenlight Future Shock podcast in Dutch. Thank you. And today, Julia will be talking about Chinese sharp power. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I assume you can see the slides and can hear me well. If not, if anything goes wrong, just give a signal. Thanks for inviting me. So I was asked to talk about Chinese sharp power, and I assume that you approached me because of my work on the Chinese Communist Party's international networks. So what I want to present today is some research that I've done together with a former colleague and co-author, Christine Hakenes. And it's a collection, it draws on several pieces that we are, several publications on the Communist Party's international department. So maybe to start with, I assume not everybody is familiar with the international department of the Chinese Communist Party. It was previously called the International Liaison Office. And this is not a new thing. It's actually a very old element. So it's a traditional element of Leninist party organizations. It has been active since the 1950s. But throughout the history, at some point it was less important, and it has been revitalized by Xi Jinping in recent years. So this international department is a party organ that is relatively high ranked. It is functioning directly under the Central Committee of the CCP, and it is tasked to organize and coordinate the external relations of the Chinese Communist Party. So if I talk about the Chinese Communist Party, I usually say CCP. So it is organizing high-level exchanges with other parties, and in the past that have been predominantly socialist parties, but as you will see later, that has changed a lot during the past few years. And it organizes all kinds of exchanges with parties, but also with other elites and business elites. And it organizes also travel or makes travel arrangements for Chinese for Chinese party functionaries at highest level if they don't have a formal government function. For example, from the propaganda department. Interestingly, this international department also organizes trainings for other parties. Whether and how much material support is provided through the CCP IDs or through this international department is not clear. But what is clear is that it also works as and functions as a intelligence gathering unit. So it is meant to advise the CCP Central Committee on decisions. It's meant to help the highest leadership to better understand what's going on in other countries. And that is, of course, particularly helpful if parties play a relevant role in other countries. And for example, in the history, the CCP ID was mainly tasked to figure out why the Soviet Union collapsed, to help the Chinese Communist Party to avoid that fate. So this is a tool that is meant to help the leadership to understand what's going on elsewhere in order for their own policy decisions, but also in order to further their own foreign interests. Now, why is this a significant entity to look at? So first, I have to say that we do not know a lot about this organization yet. It has a wide network of party relations and relations to other elites around the globe, but it has developed those networks largely beyond the scholarly attention, or out of the radar of the scholarly attention. But if we think about it, it's of course very, it might be a very significant actor, because if it is successful, it might be very consequential. This is because the focus is, it's a niche actor that focuses on party elites, and political parties are at the core of many things. So if we think about systems where parties play a role in the first place, they are at the core of public discourses. So and we know that China has invested a lot in its soft power projection and managing a narrative, managing and portraying China in a positive light. So the party channel can function as a propaganda tool. Political parties are also at the core of decision making. So the party channel may also work as an alternative to state diplomacy in order to advance Chinese foreign policy interests. And that may have strategic advantages over the usual diplomacy, because addressing parties is sometimes less in the public attention than state diplomacy, which tends to be very visible. And then finally, we can also think of this tool as a party network, as a channel for authoritarian leaders to exchange and to learn from each other, or authoritarian parties to learn and exchange from each other. So political parties are also at the core of political systems. So if a political party is not valuing democratic norms, that will have effects on a democracy in the long run. And so the party channel can also work as an instrument of authoritarian learning. And I will show you later that this is actually also one of the aims of this exchange. So in some cases, it might be a very potentially very consequential channel, but it's hard to actually pin down the effects. So this is a disclaimer already at the beginning. Now, what kind of analytical lens should we take on? So I have to say that we can approach this actor from various perspectives, and there are various discussions, and in none of these discussions the CCP ID has played a dominant role yet. So there's of course a lot of literature about China's foreign relations and China's foreign policy, but in this international relations literature, usually the focus is on state diplomacy, and the party is of course acknowledged as an important policy maker, but not so much as an implementing agency. So it has not received a lot of attention there. Then we have the soft power, this debate, where I just mentioned that China has been investing a lot in its soft power instruments, in its public diplomacy. So think of Confucianist institutes, for example. But again, in this field of literature, the CCP ID again hasn't received a lot of attention. And I think this is because it is a very niche actor. It's specialized in, if you want, public diplomacy, but targeted at elites. And then, of course, there is, what I would like to say about the soft power thing, or image management dimension, what we see is that it actually plays a role in portraying China in a specific light, in promoting perspective on China abroad. But what we also see is that it is also channeling back to the Chinese audience perspectives and potential praise from abroad. So it's also playing a key, having a key link between the external and the internal dimension of public diplomacy in the Chinese case. And then finally, there's the soft power debate or influence operations debate. I heard that you talked to Chris Walker. But in the Chinese case, very often the United Front organizations are in the focus of that debate. So the United Front, that the CCP-ID is not officially part of the United Front structure. There's a separate department which coordinates United Front organizations. So again, this CCP-ID has not been received a lot of attention in this debate. So what we find in our research is that CCP-ID is doing all these things at different points in time and with different actors, but not all everything at the same time. And so that makes it also sometimes very difficult to actually categorize or decide for one analytical lens or the other, because it can it can be seen from these different angles at the same time. And in the later talk, I will give you a few examples how we can see that. So what I'd like to do here is I first want to show you a bit the patterns of these networks, and then I also want to show you how the CCP-ID works as a public diplomacy instrument or an image management instrument. So the CCP-ID is not well studied yet, but it is interesting because that's an interesting fact, because it has one of the best maintained homepages of all Chinese government organizations and official organizations. And what we did is we took all information that we could get from the web presentation of this organization and tried to analyze that, tried to systematize what they actually post about themselves. And so this is to say, the CCP-ID has this homepage where it posts its encounters and its relationships to other parties. So this is an example of a post that you might find on this homepage. So here, representative of the German Social Democratic Party visited China, and usually we see a photo of a handshake, then we get a little bit of description of what happened there, who met whom, when, and sometimes there's also a discussion or description of what was discussed. But there are also other posts, for example, when other leaders sent letters to congratulate Xi Jinping for his remaining in or getting into the chairman position and remaining there. So there are all kinds of posts, and which in our first analysis we really looked at party-to-party engagement. So we also disregarded other actors a little bit, but I will say a few words about these other counterparts in a minute. So we focused on those party-to-party engagements, and we also tried to only look at posts where there was an actual physical interaction. So we disregarded these letters, for example. So in this first data analysis that runs from 2002 to 2017, 2002 is the year when the web page went online. Of course, the activities precede that date, and our first analysis dates from 2018. So that's why we focus here on 2017. I also have a few words to say about more recent developments. But in that 15 years, we found or we looked at more than 5,000 of these posts. And then we tried to really categorize what is in these posts, who are the counterparts, from which parties are they, and where do they meet, what do they discuss. We also tried to triangulate a little bit with other interviews and news analysis. So we basically counted and coded this information in these posts. And we also looked into specific countries and contextualized a little bit what is going on there. So this is what we find in the broader pattern for party-to-party relations. So in this 15 years, we can see that the encounters with party counterparts over time have increased. So the straight line is are all encounters with foreign parties. We found more than 460 different parties mentioned in these posts in almost all countries around the globe. In total, we could identify more than 2,600 separate encounters. So sometimes several posts describe the same meeting or the other way around. Several parties are described in one post, and we try to disentangle that, and came to the conclusion that there are more than 2,600 separate encounters with individual parties. And just to give you an idea, in 2017, Xi Jinping announced to invite another 15,000 foreign party officials to China in 5 years. So I don't think that he has actually achieved that goal with the corona crisis, but this shows you how important Xi Jinping thinks this instrument is. Now the dotted line that you can see are encounters with non-party counterparts. It could be kings, it could, or representatives, state representatives that are not mentioned in affiliation with a party. And sometimes we have encounters where we know the representative has a party affiliation, but it is not mentioned. But we can also see that, for example, in states where there's no parties around whatsoever, they're forbidden, for example, even with those countries, we see interactions, and then usually that's different counterparts. And what we can see is also that these counterparts with non-party actors are on the rise. And I think this is also where the overlap with the United Front is the most obvious. So for more recent years, I will say that, talked about that in a minute a little bit more, we also see, for example, more engagement with parliamentary groups or friendship associations that are also addressed by the CCP ID. So this is a map, just to give you a little overview how these party meetings distribute around the globe. The dots are just an aggregation for each country, just an aggregation of all meetings of parties in one country with the CCP. So the bigger the pie, the more encounters we observe with parties of a given country. And then some pies are plain and others have pieces. So each piece stands for an individual party, and the size of the pieces are proportional to the amount of meetings that a party had with the CCP. So what becomes obvious very quickly is that in some countries, the CCP ID focuses on just one party. Certainly that's the case for for those regimes in Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea, but also where we do still have communist parties in place, but it's also the case for most of Africa. And then we see that in countries where there is most of democracies, in some hybrid countries, we see that there is also meetings with opposition parties. And I can show you this in a analysis that where we matched parties with data sets, other data sets that are around in political sciences, which gave us information of whether a party is in power or in the opposition. So it becomes quite clear that more than 70% of the meetings are with parties in government. So it's a very strategic reach out to parties that are powerful. And then these opposition contacts are really only taking place in democratic countries or in countries with hybrid regimes and not in Africa. So we classify the countries according to Freedom House into the categories of free, non-free, or partially free. And then also for those autocratic countries that fall into the non-free category, there are a few opposition parties that have contacts or that are listed in these posts, but half of those fall in Russia. So you can clearly see the patterns. So there's a very clear focus on parties in power, and in democracies where there is a chance, realistic chance that opposition parties may gain power at some point, or they have been in power in the past, and then they fall into the opposition. This is where the CCP-ID tries to have stable contacts with parties of all different colors. So as a few words about the CCP-ID versus the United Front organizations. So I just talked about or focused in these last few slides on party-to-party relationships, but as I said earlier, we also observe relations to non-party organizations that we would think are more the targets of United Front players. And as I already said, the CCP-ID officially does not fall under this framework of the United Front department, but to me it seems obvious that they also pursue a United Front agenda because they are part of the party, and the United Front is about promoting the party's interests. Then what we see is, particularly in recent years, we see this outreach to parliament, to parliamentary friendship groups, business associations, to think tanks, and also to former leaders that have retired. So after retiring from office, when there's no real reason to invite them on a diplomatic channel anymore, they are sometimes invited and addressed through the CCP-ID. And we also see sometimes that there are cross references between United Front organizations in these posts of the CCP-ID. So sometimes they say we had a meeting with a representative or with a former president. Usually they're called the Friends of China, and this person was invited by another organization such as the Chinese Association for International Understanding, which is a typical United Front tour. So we see increasingly that there is coordination and cooperation between these regions. But I think it is also part of the reason why the CCP-ID is so versatile and so diverse in what it does and in how it does things in different countries has to do with the fact that it is very much context specific, how it addresses partner countries, on which actors it addresses in partner countries. And yeah, so on the Chinese side, it also very much depends which actors get involved in a country on the context in that, on the context of that country. So if you have a huge Chinese diaspora in a country, you may simply use different tools to address the country than if you don't have that. Now, these are what I just showed you are the broader patterns of how China addresses other parties around the globe. And now you may wonder, so why do they do that? What is the CCP-ID doing then when it meets these counterparts around the globe? And here are a few insights from a more textual analysis or content analysis of these posts. And what we did was, in the first round, we looked for terms that we expected to pop up. And then what we actually see is that there are different functions that this CCP-ID contexts or networks play. So first of all, it's an echo chamber for political slogans that are on vogue under these individual Chinese leaders. So we can see that different slogans that are promoted by different leaders pop up and are promoted, and then they disappear over time. For example, harmonious world and peaceful rise that were terms promoted under Hu Jintao. They are more common in the first decade that we looked at, and then when Xi Jinping comes to power and he promotes a stream, then that term is picked up in these meetings. Of course, we also see the Belt and Road very prominent. So it is also stated various times that this CCP-ID's outreach is meant to promote the Belt and Road initiative. Then what we also see is that the channel serves as a tool to get confirmation of support on core Chinese foreign policy interests. So for example, you will probably not find that very surprising, but getting confirmation on the One China principle. But we also see, for example, in 2016, when the Philippines brought in a court case, arbitration case in the South China Sea conflict with China, we see that issue popping up in these meetings where countries take position in favor of China. Or that's what then is published. I don't think they would publish if someone disagrees with that position. And then we also, for example, another example would be Tibet. Around the Olympics in 2008, there were protests in Tibet that got repressed, and that was addressed by other counterparts. And then we see in these meetings that the CCP-ID tries to brief their counterparts on the situation in Tibet and try to explain what goes on, and also to justify their position on the issue. Interestingly, in the Xinjiang issue doesn't come up very often, but I think that has to do with the time frame here in the graph, because we see in the more recent years it is actually a very prominent issue, and here is the example. So when you think about image management and portraying China in positive light, so here we see two examples from very recent years. On the left-hand side, you see a group of party visitors that gets invited to the Xinjiang region, is toured around there, has a conference there, but is also toured through this market. And then later, the visitors, predominantly from Islamic countries, are cited, quoted, saying they could eyewitness the harmonious ethnic relations in Xinjiang region. So here we see this is a tool to make others speak in favor of China, and to kind of be used as a megaphone for Chinese positions, and they entice to do that by being shown around. And apparently the idea is to use those foreigners as a group that is more credible than if the Chinese government would say that themselves. But that's something that is where we see how Xinjiang plays out here very prominently. And later, you also find these quotes from foreigners in Chinese newspapers, where that is then channeled back to the Chinese audience. So that's what I mean as an internal link of public diplomacy. So literature also agrees that in the Chinese case, public diplomacy is as much directed at the domestic audience to justify the Chinese government's or the Chinese Communist Party's rule, as it is targeted towards the outside to promote Chinese foreign policy position. The other example of image management comes from the Corona pandemic, where here the CCP-ID posts the handover of medical equipment to parties in Cyprus rather than to a government organization. And probably they also gave it to government organizations, but in addition, they also gave it to parties and used that channel to amplify their good intentions and to show that they are benign partner that tries to help out and try to mitigate this negative image that China got when the corona pandemic broke out. Finally, when we think about the party channel as a channel of organizational learning and diffusion of authoritarianism or authoritarian ruling practices, we also looked at terms like policy learning and keywords that would reflect exchange of organizational techniques. And what we see is that also increases a lot over time. So, and also the context in which those terms appear change over time. So the first thing to observe here is that in the past, the CCP also emphasized a lot that it was interested to learn from others. So, for example, we would see claims that they tried to look at Nordic countries to study the welfare state, or to Cuba or Singapore to learn from the experience in socialist revolution and party construction. But over time, we see a different way how these terms pop up, and we see a decrease in interest of the Chinese side to learn from others, and more emphasis of offering others to learn from China, and also other counterparts raise more or bring up the interest in learning from China. So the CCP would usually, or the CCP ID in this post would usually emphasize that that there is need or the opportunity to share experiences, and they become increasingly more concise. So in the past, that was more in the context of the Chinese have tremendously have made a tremendous progress in poverty eradication, for example, and now. And that was admirable, or there might be lessons to learn from that. And that what we see now is that the CCP ID is emphasizing party building and governance lessons. So that becomes really more, I think, relevant and for authoritarian party structures and for organizational tools to how to build up your party organization. Sometimes, for example, also they mention, I don't know what the code word is concisely right now, but they mentioned the relationship between citizens and the state, and that is a code word for how public opinion is managed, basically. So we also see more and more of these trainings taking place. In Africa, the CCP ID is also engaged in building party schools. And yeah, we see not only in the CCP ID, but also in the CCP ID, this offer to exchange and teach others who are willing to learn from China the Chinese model. So we do think that this is also an important channel to normalize and socialize others into the Chinese governance system and into a more authoritarian way of conceiving of governance. So to conclude, I'd say what we see is these party-to-party relations are systematic and goal-oriented. So they try to target a specific audience, and of course there is an attempt to widen the network, to institutionalize the network to other parties, but it's still very goal-oriented. then I haven't elaborated on that in the talk, but I'm happy to do that. There's also we can see that ideology and historical ties play a role, but it goes way beyond that. So we see that ties are still, so the overwhelming majority of left-leaning parties have denser ties than right-wing parties, but it's not the case that China is focusing only on parties that could be qualified or categorized at the left spectrum of right-left dimension in party systems. So there is really also a strategic choice in whom to address. And of course, the party's power in government matters a lot. And we also see that makes the analysis a bit difficult, wide variations across different contexts and different approaches in different world regions and over time, which makes it really complex. And basically, this is a very versatile actor that fulfills many different functions at the same time or in particular places at particular times. So we can see that it works sometimes as an alternative to diplomatic channels. I can give you examples if you're interested in the Q&A later. We can see this image management function that goes tries to address and solicit positive statements from external elites, and then channels that back into a domestic propaganda apparatus. And then we also can see in some aspects that there is this elite capture taking place, which would probably mostly speak to the sharp power concept that you're interested here. What I'd like to say is that it's not all activities I would think are sharp power, where sharp power plays out, but some of them. And I do think that is a potentially influential player in both realizing Chinese foreign policy interests and in normalizing and subtly promoting authoritarianism around the globe. And we do see that there's a new China model discussion where China is more actively emphasizing the potential lessons that it has to offer for other developing countries in terms of its governance principles. So I leave it here. And there's much more I could say in empirical terms, but I leave it to the audience to ask questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. This was fascinating, very packed actually. And I'm wondering we could turn this into a few more talks, a sort of series. It was so packed. Thank you. Maybe in the Q&A we will have more discussion, and so that you can open up a little bit on this. I wondered why in Africa they don't contact opposition. You said that's an exception. I am wondering why. And also, as far as I know, Russia and Turkey are very active in Africa too, both in relation to soft power, but also sharp power. Mm-hmm. I am wondering if there is any sort of authoritarian learning among these three powers, any authoritarian diffusion, any collaboration, competition, if you are aware, any of these. And last part of this question, again on Africa, is the Chinese government interfering with the democracies in Africa? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So I first have to say that I will probably not be able to answer all your empirical questions, because you see that this is very the way we got the data collection is based on what they tell us, and they will not tell us everything. They tell us only what they want us to see, right? And we do have a little bit of insight. So the comparison gives a little bit of insight, and we do have a little bit of insight through talking to counterparts. But even those are not always very keen on talking about these relationships for different reasons. So please, yeah, I hope that you understand if I will probably be unable to answer all your questions. So why Africa? Why the focus on ruling parties? I think in some of these African countries, particularly in East Africa, we see that the former, so there is a historical dimension to it. China has been active on the African continent and helped supported liberation movements throughout history in the 50s and 60s. And some of those parties are now ruling parties in African countries, and they have very close, mostly it's those relations or those countries, those parties that also have very close relations with the CCP ID. And here you see that it overlaps, so the kind of ideological dimension overlaps with a historical relationship and with being in power. So I would also say, generally speaking, for example, we can use the example of South Africa, where we see that the most contacts are with the ANC, but there are also some contacts with smaller parties. But what we can't, so we also have a paper on, we have a paper that's not yet a paper, it's not yet published, but we tried to work in Africa, where we really looked into which parties are addressed in Africa and why. And it was a lot of work because the landscape of parties changes a lot in Africa. And sometimes there are many parties that we don't even know of. So a government can have 20 parties. But what we see is that usually when these parties are addressed in the context of a hybrid regime or an autocratic regime, only those parties are addressed that where it is where there is a tacit agreement with the ruling party that it's okay to address those parties. So if they are already a collaborator with the ruling party, then they would be addressed. So I think that's the general rule, because the CCP idea is also not, it's not in their interest to antagonize ruling parties, right? And there might be cases, we tried to cross-check, but we didn't find those cases where there might be context to parties that come to power in, or that are, where the Chinese think that these parties might play a role in the future. But I would say that then they're not so keen to publish and tell us, because they don't want to antagonize the ruling party. So sometimes they reach out to up and coming parties in the anticipation that this might be a useful contact in the future. And another example would be Myanmar, where we saw very much focus on the military junta. And when the political system broke up a little bit, opened up a little bit in 2010 and following, then they reached out to all kind of also civil society groups, because those became more important and more influential, also with regard to Chinese investments that had aroused a public protest. So then those actors got addressed and approached, and that was also published. And before that, I think there were attempts to address Aung San Suu Kyi, for example, to get her agreement to form to collaborate with the military government in order to give this regime a more civilian face, but that was not published because it was not in the interest to publish that. Now, Russia and Turkey in Africa, I have to say that I don't know to what extent they collude or collaborate on how they address these elites in Africa. I am not so familiar with what Turkey and Russia are doing in Africa. So I don't think I can give you a good answer to this question.
Yeah, no problems. Thank you, Julia. You can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Fan?
Yes, thanks, Ethan. Thanks, Julia, for the wonderful presentation. And I'd like to get a little bit clarification in terms of the research method that you're using, especially the methodology. Because what I was thinking is that it's not easy to do research on China, especially the internal operation within those departments and internal operation or communication, external communication between those departments and outside. So I was wondering, like you kind of briefly mentioned the idea of triangulation of those sources. I was wondering how you gather those evidence and also those sources, and also to shed that light on those normally confidential or classified actions or documents, and how you would be able to distinguish the credibility of those sources as well. For example, their government can be a quite active actor in curating, creating, and disseminating fake news or misinformation. For example, China's government has been notoriously being a genocidal denial in this context. So, and also another thing is about the translation of those documents as well, and if there is any kind of glitch between Chinese version of documents and also the English version of documents, and how you'll be able to encounter, how you'll be able to, mitigate those kind of methodological difficulties. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks. So this is why I said at the beginning, we can only look here at what they want us to see, and there are also various reasons to believe that the CCP ID has its own organizational interest in publishing those reports. So this is why I try to be very open about the source of this research, and this is really one of the first researchers. I mean, there was David Chamberlain who looked at the CCP ID in 2007, and after that there was not so much academic attention on that actor. So this was really making use of the fact that they actually publish what they're doing with a very big disclaimer. We should take these things with a grain of salt. And we take the information that they give us and we look at the information that they tell us. Now, there are still a few ways of triangulation. So for example, what we did was we looked into cases where we would expect that more meetings would take place that are not published, and looked into newspapers of these countries to see whether we find other sources that publish about engagement or interaction. And it turned out that that didn't lead to us to believe that a lot more was taking place. My co-author had also interviews with some people from the international department, but we tend not to make that a prominent aspect because we don't want to we want to protect those sources, and some of these desks are not that big, so we don't want to be too open about that. But what she got from the interviews was more or less also in line with what we found on in these, like was in line with the patterns that we identified from looking at the big amount of publication. Disinformation and translation issues. We got a native speaker comparing Chinese publications with English ones, and we look at the English ones because it's easier for us. But the native speaker came to the conclusion that there was more or less literal translation, and sometimes the English ones were a little bit more extensive than the Chinese ones. And misinformation and fake news. So I think what we still need to do and need to do more is talking to the other side. And there's also some indications that what these counterparts think they're doing does not always stroke with what the CCP ID thinks they are doing. So, for example, in the case of Iceland, there was this controversy because it became public that such a meeting had taken place, and the Icelandic side. So that meeting was published as a discussion or a meeting where the thoughts of Xi Jinping were discussed, and indeed there was a photo taken with Icelandic members of Icelandic parties with Xi Jinping's book. But the Icelandic side said this was just a courtesy talk, and we talked about the weather. So I think the interpretations of what's going on might differ a lot. So this is what we still need to do more. But as I already said earlier, it's not always that easy, because not all, particularly in Europe, it's not always the parties do not always want to talk about their links to China. There's also, what we also can say is if there's disagreement. So, for example, we have this famous case in the summer 2 years ago when the party leader of the German Liberal Party went to China, and they went first to Hong Kong to open and to talk to democracy protesters. And then when they came to the mainland, all their contacts got cancelled. And he had a meeting with a party representative at the CPID, but there was no conversation. And in the German news, that was published because he gave an interview about it. And the title of the publication was literally, I got yelled at for 3/4 of an hour, and the Chinese representative didn't even want to shake my hand at the end. And so there was great disagreement. And we know that from the interview with a liberal party leader. But on the Chinese side, it was only mentioning that this meeting took place and full stop. So they didn't just say nothing. They said that we met the Liberal Party, but then they didn't talk about what they discussed. So my hunches or my interpretation is, if there's disagreement, then that's rather not said. But it's not that they would totally under-report that this meeting, even though it was controversial, took place. But you're right, we need more talk and conversation with the actual participants of those meetings.
Thank you, Julia. I have Kainat, Erkan, and Martin. Can you ask your questions one after another, and then Julia can respond to all of them at once? Kainat?
Thank you. Thank you, Julia, for the presentation. My question is related to what do you think are the differences and similarities between China's approach to foreign aid and its Western counterparts? So, for example, US also does pro-democracy workshops, governance workshops, and aid programs. And similarly, in your presentation, it came through cultural aid and cultural programs, aids, and all of this is being done by China as well. So I would be interested in knowing if you've observed any similarity and differences between these two. Thank you.
Erkan?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, hello. Thank you for the presentation. So my question is about the party relation with the Chinese foreign policy, the state bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So when the party target to a specific groups, building to soft power and that diplomacy, does it create a kind of competition or rivalry with the state bureaucracy? So in terms of, for example, the defining the policies, strategies, whatever, and how do they handle when there's a problem? Is there a conflict between these two ones? Okay, thank you.
Martin?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. My question, it sort of touches upon one of the first questions you answered, and also in your conclusion, but I just wanted to know whether or not in your study you noticed a difference in the language used or the topics discussed depending on the different regions of the world. Because we know, for instance, like you mentioned, the 15,000 in 2017, but I think Xi Jinping upped that number very recently for the intention to construct ties with elites in Latin America. So I wanted to know whether or not, you noticed a difference between the way that the CCPID covers these meetings depending on the region.
Thank you, Martin. Julia, I also have a question on diasporas. You said that depending on the diasporas, Chinese different Chinese government organizations are involved. I've been also working on the Turkish diaspora management, Turkish government's diaspora management, and also recently looking at the Indian one, especially from the lens of authoritarian populism. Both governments in these countries, both in India and Turkey, they are populist, authoritarian, and they've been using religion and civilizational populism. Mm-hmm. So I wonder to what extent China has been doing the same when it comes to its diasporas and dissidents abroad. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so these are good, very good questions. Somewhat difficult. So I'd like to start with a question on conflicts or collaboration with state diplomacy. It's a difficult thing to investigate because we cannot look inside these organizations, and apparently, for example, it's not even clear there are no Chinese sources on the whole budget of this organization, of this PID. What I can tell you from our case studies is that sometimes there seems to be, so there is some kind of coordination, and sometimes the party channel replaces state diplomacy. For example, Japan is a good example to show that at times when the diplomatic channel is closed because of public opinion about this shrine and war atrocities, the leaders, the governments don't speak to each other anymore, but the party still has their contacts to different parties in Japan to keep a channel open and negotiate with Japanese leaders. Another example, so here there seems to be that the party is used as a track to diplomatic channel when other channels got stuck. We see something similar happening after in Czech Republic, but also in Norway, when those countries had domestically raised, positions for in the Norwegian case, it was the Nobel Peace Prize, handing out the Nobel Peace Prize to the Chinese human rights lawyer. In Czech Republic, they took side for Taiwan, and as a result of that, the diplomatic channel again got closed. Chinese side refused to talk anymore to this government, punished this government, and then we see in items in these reports how discussions are taken up through the party channel. So in the Czech Republic, it's very obvious because they also say it in the end. So there are various meetings and you see the power brokers that are involved that are in favor of opening up the channel again. And then we see various meetings at the party channel, and in the end, the ministries come together and they sign a joint statement. And of course, the Czech side or the Norwegian side promises that they will never do it again. And then everything is fine again. But you can see in the party channel, and afterwards they say, okay, our conversation and our relationship got back to track based on the good understanding that we have achieved together in this through this party channel. So it's relatively obvious that the CCP ID can replace and contribute to what usually would happen through the state diplomacy. Whether there's also conflict, I don't know. I cannot really tell you, because that goes beyond what we can investigate with this type of data. Another answer to the question about the different discourses or a different language that is used in different world regions. So what we see when comparing different countries is that it usually the talk that is reported has contextual aspects to it. So they address this relationship in a very contextual, idiosyncratic way. At the same time, we also see attempts to kind of institutionalize and multilateralize these talks. So in the same way as we see this regional platforms that China has invested in on the diplomatic level, sort of FOCAC, Forum for Africa-China Cooperation, CELAC has a platform with China, the Middle East, and so forth. European parties and European countries have a EU-China dialogue. So the same way that China is doing that in diplomatic terms, it has also done that for the parties. So there are also parallel structures for party meetings for different world regions to reach out to different parties from a given world region in one time. And I think that already tells us that there's also kind of a, the attempt to kind of streamline these conversations and reach out to these continents in a joint meeting. So I do think that the discourses vary country by country and region by region, but at the same time, there's also an attempt to streamline these discourses. Then there was a question about the difference between Chinese aid and Western aid, and I think one can say a lot about the differences, but that would a little bit go beyond the talk now, because this is not considered to be development cooperation from the Chinese side. The difficult thing is a little bit that it's hard to kind of compare what China is doing here with what others are doing, because we do have party-to-party programs, for example, in Western development cooperation. I think on the Chinese side, they consider trainings and elite networks and network building an aim that is also part of the Belt and Road and has been incorporated into development cooperation. But I don't think that initially they would have considered this party-to-party engagement as a development cooperation thing. So I'm happy to talk to say more about the difference between Western aid and Chinese aid, but I think it would we could maybe do this at a bilateral basis later. And then there was this question whether China addresses the diaspora and uses populist regimes, but I'm not so sure that I correctly understood the question. Could you please repeat that question, Isam?
Yes, you said that different Chinese government organizations are involved depending on the size or type of Chinese diaspora abroad. So I am wondering if there are any similarities to the Indian and Turkish attempts, because these two governments have been using authoritarian populism, especially anti-Western civilizational narratives, mobilize their loyal diaspora. And in some cases, they just label the dissidents abroad as pro-Western and traitors, whatever, by using this civilizational populist rhetoric. And I am wondering if Chinese government or government organizations have been doing the same.
So here's a very general answer to your question. Because I'm not only studying this party, the CCPID, but also China in other countries more generally. And what we, of course, this discourse, anti-Western, anti-hegemonic discourse, is very prominent. And what we see, and it really, I think, is part of a defense strategy on the Chinese side. Whenever there's contestation about what's China doing somewhere else, this is brought up as a smearing campaign against China, or as someone being a tool of US hegemony and not acting in their own interest. So I observed that, for example, in Zimbabwe, where there's criticism about labor issues of Chinese investment, what the embassy then does is trying to deflect that criticism by arguing or by delegitimizing the claims of those victims by arguing that this is actually not your own claim. You have been put this in your mouth by the West because the West is interested in getting us, the Chinese, out of Zimbabwe. And the same you can see in Myanmar when there are contestation about dam projects or other infrastructure projects. Then the NGOs that fight for that are, it's said that they are Western tools. So you see that, and it pops up in different contexts. I've even seen someone making that argument here in the Netherlands. When there's criticism about whether we should look close what China's doing in the Netherlands, someone saying this is just a securitization theme that comes from the US and it's not in our own interest. So I do see these narratives, and my hunch is that there is a common source. So they don't only pop up locally, they are probably also somehow, maybe it's a kind of default answer from the Chinese side.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for these fascinating answers. And thank you everyone for joining us. This week we had Julia Bader from the University of Amsterdam. She's an associate professor there, and she's been working on Chinese Communist Party and different government organizations. And this was a fascinating talk. I'm sure there are many questions to be asked, and maybe in future we will have Julia again. But for now, that's it. And next week we will have Vincent Keating, conceptualizing Russian influence beyond unwanted flows of information, at the same time, 11 a.m. CET. And until next week, have a good time. Good time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Julia.